Today I'm going to paint one of my best figures and recreate one of the most iconic battles of World War II, the Battle of Stalingrad. Hi everyone, you are watching No Quality Dioramas. My name is Vlad and today we are building a diorama for our KV-1 tank. I choose to recreate the Battle of Stalingrad and I think the Soviet KV-1 heavy tank fits perfectly into this scene. First thing first, I need to build the base for the diorama. As always, I am using XPS foam. With the math compass, ruler, pencil and pens, I marked out the layout. The math compass helped to trace the area where I want to place the cobblestones around a fountain. The centerpiece of the diorama will be the famous Barmaley fountain that stood in Stalingrad. I carved the cobblestones pattern using a hobby knife and sharpened the texture with various tools. I started with a small screwdriver, then added more texture using crumpled foil. The result looked pretty good. I also found some old clay sculpting tool in my drawer. Turns out they were great for detailing foam cobblestones. Working with foam takes patience, especially at 1/72 scale. Believe me, it's much easier in 1/35, but not so. And for now, I'll admit that my cobblestones look, let's say, terrible. Just terrible. So I've decided I'll discuss them a bit later. Just enough so viewers understand it's cobblestone, but it doesn't steal the spotlight. Next, I cut out the section where the fountain will go, since I plan to pour epoxy resin there. I ended up removing a bit too much, so I filled it back with texture paste. That gave it volume and some nice surface texture. While the texture paste was drying, I textured the rest of the foam using the same piece of crumpled foil. And this XPS foam base had a small hole in it, so I turned it into a shell crater and filled it with a different texture paste that has a coarser grain, perfect for simulating broken earth or muddy debris. I also added a patch of ground. I didn't want the whole diorama to look too urban, so some soil texture helps balance it. And right now you can see the difference between the two types of this texture paste. Off camera I used stone and sand fixer by Vallejo to secure some small and large rocks. This will represent broken pavement, fallen debris and pieces of the shattered fountain. I also found some old chunks of plaster in my bees box, broke them down and scattered them around, again to mimic broken stone and concrete. I eventually printed a few extra pieces, including some cobblestones, to test how my FDM printer handles small prints, and honestly, it did a great job. Sure, I could have printed all the cobblestone instead of carving them by hand, but it will be taken too long and I wanted to release this video on this week. Also, when you test too many techniques on one diorama, things can get a little chaotic. Right now the diorama is gradually filling up with extra details. As you can see, there is already quite a lot going on, but I try not to overdo it. Using the same 3D printed, I printed these small lamppost bases. Here's what the diorama looks like so far. In the corner with the ground section, I also added a poster column, the kind used for hanging announcements and ads, especially since I have some small World War II era poster in my stash. They'll fit perfectly and add to the thin atmosphere. Now it's time to move on to priming. I used black from ICM. I really like how ultra matte it is, which makes it a great base coat. Then I tried using dark sea grey from ACM with the dry brush technique. The results were pretty good, and I was satisfied to a degree, but it didn't feel right for the fountain. Some of the effects were getting lost, and others I knew I could recreate better using wash, so I filled the airbrush with that same dark sea grey and sprayed the fountain area. Since this is an entirely urban scene, and after checking historical photos I found the area around the fountain was paved with concrete or cement, I decided to paint all the stones area in this color. It won't add any unwanted noise to the composition, but it will give me room to create contrast later on. Speaking of contrast, I moved on to painting small details. I used several shades here. Shadow Flash from Vallejo Panzer XS line for the red brick rubble, Light Rust from Vallejo as well, and a couple of lighter tones from ICM, like Pale Sand and Buff, to break up the palette a bit. I mixed Shadow Flash with Light Rust and painted the larger chunks of ruins, then applied some light dry brushing over them. Next up was the cobblestone painting. I am planning to partially cover it later with pigments and texture paste, but some parts will remain visible, so I wanted to add a bit of variety in color to avoid a flat, monotonous look. This is how it's shaping up so far. The diorama is starting to come to life and gain its own character. Now I need to focus on painting the wood. I am not aiming for ultra realism here, just enough to show its wood, with maybe some scorched or ragged areas. In other places I'll make it look newer, so it pops against the rest of the scene. Later I found out that the Barmaley fountain was originally made of brick and then covered with plaster. That means all the cracks and damage should be painted red to simulate the exposed brick underneath. Of course I could make it more detailed and refine it, but the reality is I built this fountain in just one day, and I simply didn't have the time for that level of detailing. After that, I used chocolate brown from ICM to paint the bottom of the crater. This adds some variation and helps show that the explosion tore the ground down to the dirt. Then I painted the advertisement column and lamppost bases using 4BO from ICM. Now I use the sponge technique and various grey tones to add texture and color variation to the fountain. With that done, it was time to move on to pigments. I use homemade pigments made from soft pastels. They mix together really well. By blending different shades I can create almost any color I needed, without reaching for acrylic paint. To fix the pigment in place, I used Pigment Fixer by Vallejo. It works perfectly and I am more than happy with it. Here is what it looks like at this point. Of course, it's still a work in progress and many parts will be refined later, but for now I wanted to focus on some additional pigment works, this time to simulate rubble from a destroyed building. I used crushed pigments in red, orange and yellow tones. I mixed them together lightly so they still remain some variety. It's a great way to replicate shattered brick. This time I mixed the pigments with real dirt and added a bit of plaster. That way the effect won't rub off easily if the diorama gets touched. I did the same with some grey tones to break up the overall reddish palette. And here is how it turned out. I think it looks pretty good, but again, this still isn't the final stage. Next up, washes, and I'll be using a lot of it. As always, I go with an oil-based wash using Van Dyke Brown, my favorite. I am confident it will work perfectly here. Here is how it looks after the wash has dried. The diorama now looks dusty, dirty and battle-worn. Exactly what I was going for. Except in some places. The wash is a bit too heavy and doesn't look natural. So it's time to grab a cotton swab and clean off the excess. But before that, I placed the tongue on the diorama just to see how it fits. And it looks great. But back to the wash. I wiped it off in the areas where it felt excessive. For example, on the fontaine, there can be dust and a bit of grime, but not full on mud. That will be too much. After that, I focused on the small elements, the lampposts and the poster column. I didn't go too deep here, just added some weathering and chipped effect with the sponge method. Simple and effective. Now it's time to add posters and World War II era newspaper, which I placed in a few spots on the theme. As you can see, the posters are already in place. Then I painted the edges of the posters to remove the bright white border. After that, started placing the newspaper. To fix them in place, I used gravel and sand fixer from Vallejo again. It works perfectly as I said and leaves a nice matte finish, just what I needed. I also wanted to add a bit of furniture to the scene. What you see on screen now is me painting one of my furniture kits. You can download it via link in the description. It's a small set of cabinets that can be used for various purposes. Kitchen shelves, book storage, whatever you prefer. That's part's up to you. But I truly believe that this detail can give your diorama some new appearance. The painting process is quite simple. For the base color I used chocolate brown by ACM. Then I applied a very diluted olive green, almost like a highlight layer. It gave me a nice variation in tone. Next, I used buff to highlight the edges and give them more contrast. Now, don't worry, at this stage the cabinet might look a little rough, but once I weathered it and added some dust effect, it turned out exactly how I imagined it. For the weathering, first I used very diluted acrylic color called Tan Earth. When it dried, I used very diluted chocolate brown to simulate a little bit darker dust. Here is the final look, and as you can see, even though it's printed on an FDM printer, the details look up well and don't ruin the overall diorama. They actually enhance it. And I love it. From one of my other Calls 3D sets, I also added a German fuel drum. I painted it with German dark grey by ACM and used the sponge method to apply rust. Why rust? Because I'm going to pour epoxy into fontaine, and if the drum barrel is submerged, it has to look weathered and corroded. Now, ladies and gentlemen, time to paint the figure. I won't go into too much detail here, because I already have a full video on painting this exact figure. What I will say is that I have improved a lot since then. Following your advice, I invested in better quality brushes and picked up around 20 new paint colors that opened up a lot of options for color blending and tonal variation. At this point the figure is fully base coated and shaded. I just need to do some highlights and move on to painting the smaller elements: belts, straps, pouches and the pistol holster. For the holster I used chocolate brown as the base, then highlighted a bit with tan earth, and after that I add a bit of light rust to give the leather some warmth and depth. As for the face, I'm really happy with how it turned out. I think this painting style actually looks better for 1/72 scale than some of my earlier attempts. Maybe it's time to make a new video about figure painting. I don't know. Anyway, here is the final result. I would say it's quite solid, and that means we are ready for the final step: pouring epoxy resin. So here it is, folks. This time I had no doubts, no struggle with idea or execution. Everything just clicked. You could say I felt the thing from the inside, and it came out just the way I wanted. Maybe even better in some aspects. Sure, I could tweak a few things or add some extra detail, but that's beside the point. The diorama is finished. It has everything: historical setting, real events, accurate vehicle, detailed figures, and a bunch of handmade extras. And by the way, all those extras are available to download via the link in the description on my Cult 3D page. My models are always fairly priced. I try to keep things accessible, because after all, buying the models is just the start. Printing it costs money too. With my sets you can print, for example, 5 barrels instead of 1. Not bad, right? So I hope my models help enhance your dioramas, and that my work becomes part of your own creation. With that, I bid you farewell, my friends. Thank you for likes, dislikes, comments, not comments, sharing this video, and thanks again for watching. See you next time.